Our keynote speaker, Nadine Strossen. You can Google her and you'll see a long list of achievements and roles she played. Beyond the law professor, the John Harlan law professor at New York Law School, for nearly 20 years, the president of the American Civil Liberties Union. So all the big cases and campaigns you may remember from post 9/11 era and along the 90s before that were under her leadership. I remember the FIRE, which I always remember is
Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression.
Expression, but used to be
Education.
Right. The Foundation for Individual Rights. In the past, in education, focusing on higher education, but now expression in general, and an advisory board member at the Heterodox Academy. So you can Google all of that and the books she wrote. But I want to say a few words about the person. Well, we can go back to the books she wrote because there are many. Here I think of the most famous ones. Present her tendency, I think, to take on battles that no liberal in a straight mind would have taken upon herself. One is protecting hate speech, well, not the speech, but protecting the constitutionality of hate speech, and another opposing censorship of pornography, which I think indicates her commitment to free speech. And if you followed her appearances across her micro country of the United States and the globe, you'd be hard pressed to believe it's one person. So she really has the energy of a few combined in her really fearless and tireless fights for free speech. So lots of knowledge, wisdom, and experiences that I hope we can learn from. So with that, I will join you.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Roy, for that incredibly gracious introduction. And before you start interviewing me, as we agreed, I want to thank you for the great job that you've done, not only in organizing this conference, but also in standing up for academic freedom and free speech. And I briefly want to say how meaningful it is for me to be in Israel. My husband is Israeli. I have Israeli family members who are kind enough to come here. Your situation is unique, and you're facing unique challenges. My heart, as well as my head, go out to all of you. That said, with a full appreciation for the special circumstances and challenges you face here, what I have been struck by over and over from the fantastic presentations I've heard here, my only regret is that I could only hear half of the presentations. The rest, I promise you, I look forward to watching online. But I have learned that there are an amazing number of similarities between our countries and the challenges that we face from across the ideological spectrum to academic freedom and free speech, challenges from both within our institutions and from external forces. So I really have learned a lot, and I look forward to continuing that learning process through our conversation.
So I have a long list of questions, but I need not ask them all. And in the spirit that Neta instilled in us earlier, if along the road, and we'll leave time for Q&As anyhow, but you can also raise your hand if it pertains to something specific we said and chip in as we go on. So I really want to begin on a more personal note. As I said earlier, you travel a lot, you appear in many campuses, but I think since October 7th, the pace of that has exponentially perhaps grown. And I just want to ask, what that's been like for you, what you experienced in these places that you visit since October 7th, and how your visits and these encounters differ from the campuses you knew before.
You know, in the United States, among those of us who advocate for free speech, we've long shared a saying that everybody believes in freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. And unfortunately, that pattern has continued after October 7th, when the climate on campus in particular changed a lot with respect to free speech in this way. Prior to October 7th, most of our campuses, as survey after survey demonstrates, are overwhelmingly to the left of center in terms of the political beliefs of faculty and students, especially at the most elite universities and liberal arts colleges. You have entire departments where there are almost no conservative speakers at all. And therefore, the dominant form of speech suppression, because we have a First Amendment that very strongly restricts government suppression of speech. So the dominant form of speech suppression came through what is often called cancel culture, or the social pressure or peer pressure that came from within the community itself. Given the overwhelmingly left of center of gravity on campuses, it tended to be conservative speakers or even classical liberal perspectives, those that went against the progressive orthodoxy that was dominant on campus, tended to be the ones that were suppressed through peer pressure, and often through viral social media campaigns that actually visited very severe consequences in retaliation for speech that was unpopular. Specifically with respect to Israel-Palestine, the dominant progressive view on campus has been very much pro-Palestinian, and if you were looking at speech suppressive incidents on that subject, overwhelmingly they involved deplatforming and shoutdowns and shutdowns of not only pro-Israeli speakers, but sometimes even anybody from Israel or anybody who was identified as a Zionist. After October 7th and the government responses that occurred after October 7th, starting with the Biden administration, which was then in power. So I really want to underscore this. Trump is in a category of his own in terms of free speech violations, but he is building on foundations that were established by prior presidents, including the Biden administration, quite soon began advocating for what I believe is an overly broad concept of punishable anti-Semitic speech that included speech that was in any way critical of anything that was done by the Israeli government. And so there tended to be suppression of pro-Palestinian, i.e. progressive viewpoints, and there accordingly was a dramatic shift that those to the left of center on campus who had been poo-pooing the concept of we have a speech problem and cancel culture doesn't really exist, and what are you complaining about? Everything is fine on campus. Suddenly, and also I should say, were categorically critical of the concept of free speech. And believe me, as a free speech advocate, I defend criticizing free speech. I love debating the principles, but the orthodox perspective on campus was that free speech is overrated, censorship is exaggerated. After October 7th, that shifted, and those who had not been concerned about free speech problems on campus suddenly became concerned. And I will even say beyond campus, mainstream, i.e. left of center, powerful media such as the New York Times, National Public Radio, which had for many years been poo-pooing any concerns about free speech, suddenly became very, very concerned about free speech. Now, the same thing, unfortunately, happened in the other direction. Starting with Donald Trump and many Republicans, Trump campaigned as the pro free speech, anti-censorship president, right? One of his very first executive orders on his very first day in office proclaimed that he was restoring free speech. And yet we know that not only in the wake of October 7th, but even more recently in the wake of the assassination of right-wing activist Charlie Kirk, many on the right who had professed an adherence to free speech, and opposition to censorship, and opposition to cancel culture, and opposition to censoring hate speech. And they were denouncing the snowflakes on college campuses who were, protesting any speech that made them uncomfortable or that was divisive. Suddenly the tables turned. And all of those anti-speech arguments were invoked by leading Republicans and conservatives. Our United States Attorney General, Pam Bondi, called for censoring hate speech. And Donald Trump immediately said, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. Anybody who criticizes me, that's hate speech. Cultural commentators and politicians who had denounced the cancel culture were proudly calling for the canceling of anybody, including tenured university professors who made what they considered to be disrespectful remarks about Charlie Kirk. And they said, oh, that's not cancel culture, that's accountability culture. Exactly the same arguments that a few years earlier had been made by folks on the other end of the ideological spectrum. So I just have to say, I'll quote one of my allies in some of the free speech organizations in the United States. He expressed an idea that many of us have expressed, but I think he said it particularly well when he said, those of us who try our best to consistently, even-handedly, neutrally defend freedom, even for the thought that we hate, we have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that our allies are always going to be transient.
So the tables have turned dramatically, and it brings a thought about sort of parallels. When you wrote against censorship of pornography, one of your arguments was that it actually, censoring pornography actually victimizes women or labels them as victims and ingrains that view of women as victims. And I was wondering whether we may be seeing something similar in the struggles against anti-Semitism, in the sense that if we need to censor to protect Jewish students from anti-Semitism, we're going the same path, we're going down the same path.
It's an excellent question, Roy, and if I can, I would like to expand the analysis beyond that particular disadvantage of censorship, because my conclusion after consistently, so far, open-minded, through decades of, literally decades of thinking about these issues, writing about them, speaking, debating, I have continued to conclude that censoring any kind of hate speech, including pornography, which in the United States, powerful, influential contingent of so-called radical feminists described as a subset of hate speech, namely sexually explicit speech that was degrading or demeaning or dehumanizing toward women. Therefore, the argument went fueling discrimination and violence against women. And that's the same argument that has been made for many, many decades as a reason for censoring other kinds of hate speech, whether it's anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, you name it. The rationale is that essentially that we have to choose between freedom of speech or equality. Sometimes it's pitted even more dramatically as we have to choose between civil liberties and civil rights, between liberty and equality. And my experience based on the United States, not only now through my lifetime, but throughout history, and also my study of what's happened around the world and my discussions with human rights activists in many other countries, is that that is a false binary, that we cannot have meaningful equality and dignity and diversity and inclusivity and belonging, that whole host of values that are essential to human rights. We cannot have them without the most robust freedom of speech, and speech that is robust enough that it extends even to what people call hate speech. Because you need not take my word for it. Look at history, look at the current record. What we consider, what many of us consider to be pro-human rights speech that is positive for women, for Jews, for other minorities or traditionally disempowered groups, other people consider to be hate speech. And I'll give you a current example from the United States. Black Lives Matter advocacy. Many of us consider to be completely furthering of human rights and therefore the antithesis of hate speech, designed and intended to counter discrimination and to foster inclusivity and equality. And yet, many powerful government officials and others have argued forcefully that Black Lives Matter advocacy is hate speech against white people, hate speech against police officers. And there actually have been efforts to censor on that basis. So my bottom line, Roy, is that that even though I think there is a plausible rationale for suppressing hateful speech, including pornography as defined by certain radical feminists, because it definitely can lead to some harmful consequences, that it is even more harmful specifically to the shared goals of equality and inclusivity. It is even more harmful to empower the government or university officials to have the inherently discretionary power to pick and choose which ideas are hateful and which are not. In the Gaza-Palestine context, we have people, many voices on campus arguing that pro-Palestinian speech, by definition, is hate speech against Jews and against Israelis. And conversely, we have others who are arguing that pro-Zionist speech constitutes, by definition, hate speech against Palestinians, Muslims, and Arabs. So that, to me, illustrates the danger of censorship.
But a follow-up on that, can't we make any value judgments saying, for instance, hate speech against blacks is not the same as against whites because of power imbalances, historical structures, et cetera, et cetera?
So I guess one could say that you're trying to argue that one should be more permissible, hate speech against white people. I think the problem with that comes back to who is going to decide. Is advocacy, to use a very current, not hypothetical example, is advocacy of Black Lives Matter, should that even be seen as hate speech against white people? And who is going to decide that? And let me be, I want to be affirmative rather than just saying, I think censorship has a lot of problems. We should keep our eye on what the shared goals are. And for all of the diversity, wonderful diversity of opinions that I've heard here, it seems to me that we all share a basic commitment to individual freedom and to community, to individual autonomy and diversity and inclusivity and equality. And what can we affirmatively do to promote those goals. Especially as educators, it seems to me that the most important thing we have to do is to increase people's information, increase people's dialogue, increase people's thinking and understanding. And all of those strategies, to me, are the antithesis of trying to police what can be said. We should encourage more speech rather than less speech. And I've been very heartened by a number of presentations I've heard here, including from former provosts and deans and so forth, leaders who say that on your campuses, when you have had complaints about hate speech or terrorist speech allegations of such, that the intervention is an educational intervention rather than a disciplinary one, that is more likely to actually foster the goals that we are seeking to promote.
I want to go back to an iconic moment of the last 2 years, which is the by now infamous hearing with the university presidents on the Hill, in which it's context dependent became the famous last words of academic careers. But when you think about it, the answer given there legally was probably the correct answer. According to U.S. law, it is context dependent. So was there a way to fare better in those hearings?
Yes, I mean, it's easy to be, as we say, 20/20 quarterback. I'm not a sports person, but, judging by hindsight. But I think I've been asked that kind of question many times, and I definitely would have answered it differently. And I'm not sure everybody knows the question that Roy is talking about, that there were 3 university presidents, Harvard, MIT, and Penn, that were called before a congressional committee in early December of 2023 when there were allegations of anti-Semitic harassment of Jewish students taking place, complaints about pro-Palestinian advocacy. And first of all, I want to say, even though I for many, many years have been highly critical of universities for tolerating the kinds of cancellation pressure and ideological orthodoxy that I've already mentioned. 2 wrongs do not make a right, and I think it was very troubling that powerful politicians called in university presidents and were grilling them. I think that in itself was quite offensive to academic freedom. To me, it smacked of McCarthyism, where the major tool that was used, after all, was grilling before a congressional committee. Beyond that, the question was asked over and over and over again in a rather harassing manner, a bullying manner. What about students who are making anti-Semitic chants? There may have been a specific example calling for genocide from the river to the sea and so forth. Would that or would that not be protected speech on your campus? And every single one of them, at least one of them was a constitutional law professor, gave the constitutionally correct answer of it depends, because speech may not be punished consistent with First Amendment free speech principles solely because of the idea that it conveys. That would violate what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of free speech, viewpoint neutrality, that government, or in this case a university, has to remain neutral with respect to the viewpoint, the idea, no matter how loathsome we might consider it, no matter how hateful or hated it might be. You don't answer it with speech suppression, you answer it with more speech. And that gets to what they didn't say. Their answer should not have stopped by saying, it depends. They should have explained. They should have explained that even consistent with that paramount viewpoint neutrality principle, there is a complementary principle, which is often called the emergency concept. And one of the speakers that I heard today referred to something similar in Israeli law. I think she called it the near certainty concept. That when you go beyond the viewpoint or the message of the speech and you consider it in its overall context, if in the facts and circumstances it either directly causes or imminently threatens certain specific harm, such as intimidation or bullying or threatening or harassing or intentional incitement to imminent violence, then it can and should be punished. And by that point, there were many allegations, often documented by video, that at Harvard and these other campuses, there had been context-specific instances where Jewish students or Israeli students were subject to speech that seemed very much, from the evidence available, to constitute punishable true threats or harassment, or even worse, there were some examples of physical assaults, and that should have been addressed. Yeah, oh, and also a shooting. Thank you for reminding me of that. The additional point, and I think this was where there was a lot of adverse reaction to this testimony in the United States, these same college presidents had never strongly, take out the word strongly, had not defended the viewpoint neutrality principle with respect to any other kind of hate speech against any other minority group. To the contrary, we free speech activists had documented case after case after case where students and faculty members successfully shut down controversial ideas that were considered to be insulting or offensive to other minority groups. And that double standard happens to violate basic anti-discrimination and equality norms, and I think that this revulsion should result in a leveling up of the revulsion of the at the double standard should result in a leveling up of free speech protection, not only for anti-Semitic speech that does not satisfy suppression standards, but the emergency standard, but also for other forms of so-called hate speech. And last, but very far from least, this is a point I already made, to say that we are not going to censor speech solely because of its anti-Semitic or anti-Palestinian content does not mean we do nothing. We are educational institutions. We have a responsibility, and we have the tools and the expertise to deal with the actual problem, which is to counter those attitudes, to counter the ignorance and the misinformation and the disinformation. The emergency standard of speech protection was first articulated on the United States Supreme Court by our very first Jewish Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis. As some of you may know, there was enormous, blatant anti-Semitism at the time, and he was opposed by many powerful politicians expressly and unabashedly because he was Jewish. He ultimately was confirmed, became one of the great civil libertarian justices on the Supreme Court, and in an opinion that he wrote in the early 20th century as a dissent, ultimately became endorsed as the majority, not only the majority, but the unanimous opinion of the Supreme Court in 1969 and by every single justice since then. And when he said that speech may not be restricted solely because its ideas are hated or feared, he said, men feared witches and burned women. I love that feminist example. He then went on to say, only an emergency can justify repression. And he then went on to say, rather than suppressing the speech that we fear, we have to answer it. We have to educate. We need more speech. So that, what they said was fine, but it was stopped so far short of their educational responsibility and their responsibility to protect against physical assaults and speech that is constitutionally unprotected.
In fairness, I'm not sure they were allowed to speak much after those words. Are there any limits to that idea? I told you we were in a gathering or a discussion among a few academics, and a hypothetical came up. It's 1920s Germany. You're the president of a higher education institution, and a student group wants to host Hitler on campus. Do you allow that? And unfortunately, two of the Jews in the room, including me, had to come to the conclusion that yes, as we tried to analyze it. Colleen is here, she was a third on that. But I don't know what I think of my answer there.
Well, that's so interesting, and I do agree with one point of agreement between our two fantastic luncheon speakers who had a lot of interesting disagreements, but they said these are hard questions. I generally agree with that, but Roy, you know that my reaction when you told me you were going to ask me that was, I think that's a no-brainer, precisely because of my absolute loathing of Hitler and Nazism. And I have to say, I think that's a widely shared, if not universal, sentiment, but I have a particular reason, since my father barely survived imprisonment in the forced labor camp at Buchenwald, where he almost died of malnutrition and severe illness. So I certainly have no love lost for Hitler. And I'm not saying but, I continue to believe that the most effective way to counter dangerous ideas and brutal practices is through exposure and discussion and debate and disclosure, not through attempted suppression. And we know that this is the experience in the Weimar Republic actually validates this. Many of us use the term the Weimar fallacy for a common trope that is trotted out, that, oh, if only they had censored Hitler and the other Nazis, they wouldn't have risen to power and the Holocaust wouldn't have happened. Not true. There were extremely strict anti-hate speech laws that were strictly enforced. I've gone back and I've read some of the writings by, there was a Jewish organization at the time similar to the Anti-Defamation League in the United States that had chapters throughout Germany, and they actually provided lawyers pro bono to either bring civil lawsuits against hateful anti-Semitic speech, or they went to local prosecutors to get them to institute prosecutions. And there were many prosecutions, many of them successful, including against the notorious Julius Streicher and der Stürmer. Hitler himself was banned from speaking for quite a substantial period in Bavaria, and the Nazis actually welcomed the trials that resulted from the enforcement of these laws as propaganda platforms that drew to them attention that they otherwise would not have received, and gained them sympathy that they otherwise would not have received. My dear friend and colleague, Greg Lukianoff, who is the CEO and president of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, his pet reason for defending free speech, I mean, both of us have many reasons, but Greg talks about the power of the importance of knowing. If somebody has certain hateful anti-Semitic ideas, aren't we safer knowing about it and having the opportunity to expose them, having the opportunity to debate them? Having Hitler present at a university in the United States, I don't know if that was part of the hypothetical, might hopefully have roused more concern than unfortunately did exist in my country at the time to do something about the plight of European Jewry.
I want to ask one more question before I pause for questions from the audience. The university or the campus is a community in its own, regardless of outside society. And the question is, doesn't a dean or a president, isn't she justified in expecting faculty and students to protect communal life in a way? We heard yesterday about this 6-week moratorium in Tel Aviv University saying, no demonstrations so things can calm down. Dean Levenstein-Lazar shared the dilemma this morning, which again involved how the actions of faculty can implicate on some sort of cohesion among the community, this academic community. Is that not fair from presidents to say, you can't do that because it just harms our sense of community?
The devil is in the details. I think each individual incident has to be looked at in its own terms, but let me make some broad generalizations. Number one, the point about universities constituting communities is a very important one, and itself reflects what in the United States are First Amendment freedoms. I assume you have the counterpart here in Israel, namely freedom of association, the right of a group of individuals to constitute an organization that has a certain purpose and certain values. Now, second point, in the university, there are multiple different contexts. And I've told you, as those university presidents told you, that whether speech is protected, the extent to which it's protected, depends upon the context. So if you are in a classroom and you are a faculty member who is teaching a certain course, you have not only the right to decide what to say, how to say it, what not to say, because freedom of speech involves freedom to choose how we express ourselves and how we communicate. But in addition to that right to decide how to communicate effectively with your students, which I would certainly assume includes not using hateful speech or disrespectful speech, you have a professional responsibility to not only educate them in the subject matter, but using myself as an example, as a law professor, we are training, and we're at a law school, right? So we are training future professionals. We have a responsibility to require them to communicate in professionally appropriate ways. I have absolutely no problem enforcing, it's in all of my course manuals, going back as far as you can go through my files, enforcing a viewpoint neutral, content neutral, time, place, and manner restriction. When you are in this class, you are free to express any viewpoint, but it has to be germane to the topic that we are talking about, and it has to be conveyed in a way that is in professionally appropriate language that would be suitable in a court of law. I used to say that, but some Israeli friends of mine last night told me that in the high court here, you're having some very, unprofessional modes of expression. But kidding aside, and that any point may be made, but it must be substantiated by evidence or by analysis. It cannot be conclusory, and it certainly may not involve any ad hominem remarks. So that kind of, if you want to say civility code, is not only consistent with free speech, but I think consistent with academic freedom and responsibility. And one of the papers, and I'm so sorry, I'm going to forget the name of the presenter, was about the responsibility that goes with academic freedom, and I think that's a very important point. But in other contexts, if you were talking about the public square counterpart on campus, which in the U.S. is usually a mall or an open space on campus, that's the counterpart of a public park. There, I think what the community shares is a commitment to the most robust exchange of ideas. And there, I would say, as long as the speech does not violate the emergency concept, it should be protected, consistent with the community value of vigorous discussion and debate.
Your mentioning of civility brought another question, but I want to see first if people want to make a comment or ask a question. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you. I have two questions. First is related to...
If you can just raise your voice, because I think they don't hear you, can't hear you in the back.
The first question I would like to ask you is relating to Trump. We all know that Trump is very well known because usually because of his critique on mainstream media, relating to mainstream media and the fact that he uses his own media and alternative media in order to deliver his own messages. So from one hand, when you say that after October 7th, there was a shift in his ideology or strategy, what is your opinion about his ideology before October 7th, when we know, and even after October 7th, when we still know that he strongly opposes mainstream media for, even for minor issues. He's criticizing them and choosing to deliver his message through his own media. And the second question, which was it strikes me what you talked about, the pornography and anti-Semitism and the ability to express and deliver these messages, is the question related, we as media scholars teach our students, the first thing that we teach and think about and debate is the question, for example, would you allow a terrorist to talk on the media, right? So what is your opinion relating to freedom of speech of terrorists? And we see it now with the hostages, with the horrible films that were the hostages. So it's basically whether we should give a stage to the terrorists and show all of this theater or not.
I just want to add that we have a 1980s Supreme Court decision in Israel that answered that in the affirmative. There was a ban on interviewing PLOters, and it was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the court said you cannot predetermine that you will not voice them. Right? It could be certain content that it's illegal, etc., but you can't decide not to interview them at all.
Yeah, so let me start with that question then, and thank you for that, Roy, which would be the same outcome in the United States. But I took your question to be not what the legal rights or wrongs are, but more of a professional ethics, because I would defend the right of a journalist to make the opposite determination, right? They have no obligation to platform everybody, and they have to make a strategic decision what is served and what are the positives and what are the negatives. And I think that would have to be a determination that would have to be made on a case-by-case basis. So not being familiar with that case, let me give you a case that fairly recently provoked a lot of debate in the United States. The New York Times a couple of years ago and we have a lot of ongoing controversy about black-white race relations, especially in the wake of the horrible murder of George Floyd in 2020. The New York Times did which is a very left-of-center progressive newspaper in its orientation, and very committed to anti-racism. It had featured something called the 1619 Project, which basically reinterprets the U.S. history through a racial supremacy lens. So this is not a publication that it has any sympathy at all toward discrimination against African Americans. It did a very in-depth profile of a longtime white supremacist, a member of the KKK, a white guy, who fell in love with a black woman. And through that experience, surprise, surprise, repudiated his prior views. And it presented to me a fascinating case study, because I'm always concerned about what effective steps can we change to redeem people from such hateful groups. So I thought it was a fantastic article. The New York Times suffered a deluge of criticism. How dare you have made him, that you were the person who spoke about academic responsibility. I'm so sorry, I forgot your name, but thank you. And remind me of your name. Yeah, well, thank you again for that. But how can you do that? You're giving him a platform, and so I think, as a media ethics expert, you might know, I assume there's no clearly correct answer and it's being debated. As to Donald Trump, I don't know the man's motivations, but if I look at his actions, there is a consistent pattern of punishing any expression, any speaker, any institution who says anything critical of him or his policies. That's the only through line that I see.
in relation to the best way to deal with speech is to have more speech, or to counter it, or to respond to it. The problem is, and I think it's being discussed today, is that people are too scared to get up because of the social cost.
Yeah, yeah.
And in the panel at lunchtime, I think it was Professor Barak,
Yeah.
was saying it actually takes courage today here to stand up and to say that people like the government.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same in the States at the moment as well. And it would be the same in Australia, even though our government's terrible, right?
Yeah.
but so what happens then is that you can't get people responding because people want to have friends. They want to be seen as socially acceptable. And so that argument is not working for us now.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with that?
Yeah. It's the question that I ask myself over and over again. So let me just amplify on that. Your name is Penina, right? Yes. Excellent question to this extent that, and you and others have made this point throughout the conference that, and my husband actually made it in his presentation as well, that regulations and laws, even the most speech protective laws, while they are necessary for a vibrant experience of free speech or academic freedom, are not sufficient. That is the starting point, but it is never going to be enough in a culture where there are powerful non-government forces that therefore are not subject to legal constraint, but to the contrary, are protected, right? You're going to criticize, you're going to call somebody, you know, an anti-Semite or, you know, whatever epithet you want to use, that's protected free speech probably, but it has a speech suppressive impact. And this is where I think that free speech really is difficult because for those of us who want to nurture a free speech culture as opposed to a cancel culture, we have to urge people to engage in some self-censorship, right? You have the right to say something that is even harshly critical of somebody, but if in the aggregate that kind of harsh criticism adds up to people not wanting to talk because they don't want to face that kind of harsh criticism, that is negative in terms of free speech. And so I think, you know, surveys in the United States have shown, including extremely recently, that even though we now have a massive new government censorship under Trump, that we did not have previously, the First Amendment is still standing strong, and those speech suppressive actions are consistently being struck down by the courts. There are many monitors that, you know, have taken, kept track of literally hundreds of cases now that have been brought against speech suppressive restrictions by the Trump administration. And the courts are mostly, even judges that were appointed by Trump are ruling against them. But in addition to that, we still have massive self-censorship, not of the positive kind where we are editing ourselves for the sake of furthering, encouraging other people to speak up, but of the negative kind where people are not speaking their true feelings or ideas or even asking questions because they're afraid of some actual concrete, tangible consequences, such as shaming and shunning and ostracizing and losing jobs. And you can't change culture from the top down alone. I think those of us especially who have powerful positions, especially tenured faculty members, it doesn't take courage, right? We have the most secure jobs that exist, at least in the United States. We have the purpose of academic freedom is precisely to enable us fearlessly to voice what we consider to be the truth. And it's a pity that that is not happening as much as it should from the top, but it has to start there, but it can't end there. It has to come from the grassroots up, and we have to do everything we can to encourage and empower students and student leaders to raise their voices and to engage in respectful but robust discourse with other students. In the United States, this movement has been bubbling up on college campuses organically. Student groups, surveys again show that while students are massively self-censoring, they are very frustrated by it, and they're hungering for dialogue, including about Israel, Gaza, and looking for opportunities to exchange, to learn more, and to exchange ideas with people who have different perspectives. So, you know, that's sociologists and anthropologists are the ones who are experts in changing culture. Don't talk to me as a lawyer.
We're talking about changing culture, not necessarily in changing it. So you actually led me to what I thought to conclude with, which is really, you mentioned tenured professors and that they don't need courage, but that really is a different reality for students. So maybe to conclude is, what would you say to students that, as you mentioned, want to talk about these things, on the one hand, are often outraged by things they see on campus, just physically, emotionally outraged, not necessarily, you know, analyze it as, but are just provoked. And the same students, on the other hand, but the same students might find themselves self-censoring in class when, you know, they feel maybe the professor won't like what they have to say, or definitely their peers. How do you overcome that?
So I am extremely sympathetic with students and others, especially in vulnerable positions, who self-censor. They don't have the job security that I have the privilege of having, so I would never be adversely judgmental toward or critical of any such person. Rather, what I find extraordinary are the students who do speak up despite the negative potential consequences they face, and I like to talk to them and figure out what makes them tick and to share that with other students. So let me just give you one example. A student at Yale Law School, appropriate since we're at a law school, a couple of years ago was subject to not only peer pressure, but pressure from a couple of deans. I'm looking at you, Joe, this was before your time at Yale Law School, who basically said, and he had the perspicacity to videotape everything, so that's always a good strategy, basically said that if he did not issue an apology for a statement he made that was completely innocent in its intent, and some people read some kind of complicated potential racist message into it. By the way, he was Native American. He was part of a smaller, tinier minority than African Americans. If he did not issue an apology that they had written for him, they would withhold the recommendation that is required to become a practicing lawyer, a recommendation on character and fitness. So how could he withstood that pressure? He refused to sign, and ultimately he was vindicated, but he went through, I can't imagine the agony and the uncertainty and the peril in terms of his future career as a lawyer that he managed to face. And I had the opportunity to meet him and talk with him. And he said he had two pieces of advice. One that is relevant to all of us. He said, because I was speaking to him in my capacity as a leader of a couple free speech organizations, he said, you guys have to do a better marketing job. If we students knew that you were there to have our backs legally and in terms of communications and, you know, psychological support and moral support, that would be very helpful. So that's something all of us can do, to even as just, and that ties into his second point as well. Actually, he made this one first. He thought it was even more important. He said, you need to have one or two people. It doesn't have to be a lot of people, but you need at least one or two that you totally trust and who totally trust you. That, you know, like the rest of the world can be hostile to you and against you and shaming you and shunning you, but as long as you have just a couple close friends. And so I think all of us certainly can provide that kind of support. And this is very much on a retail basis, right? Individual by individual, because I think that's how cultures change. My husband, the economist, would say we have to change structures as well, and we certainly can do that as academics, but as academics and leaders and human beings, we can and we must provide that personal support. I can't tell you how many faculty members, I heard one just yesterday from the University of Virginia Law School, talking about incidents of enormous hostility and suppression. In this case, it was about a case that he had argued before the US Supreme Court that was politically unpopular on his campus, even though he won 9-0 on an ideologically divided Supreme Court. But the University of Virginia Law School was to the left of the Supreme Court, and they didn't like it, and faculty members were even throwing plates of food at him. And he said, you know, I haven't fact-checked it, but he knew that he was being videotaped. He said, and this was so typical of what I've heard, not one single faculty member or administrator spoke up for me, and his students were also being harassed, spoke up for me or my students. So it may seem like very little, but let me tell you, from the perspective of these people who are being punished, speaking up and standing up for them, not just for free speech and academic freedom in the abstract, but person to person on the ground, all of us can really make a difference, and especially in the aggregate.
What a wonderful way to conclude. I want to thank you a lot. And I want to thank everyone here for coming. I think we had an interesting, thought-provoking day. I wish you all lots of success with it. Everybody's facing different challenges in this area back home and in their institutions. So all the best for all of us. And hopefully we'll find some answers and balance these considerations. Have a great day. Thank you.